Dear listener, before the sea swallowed him, and before history exposed his corpse, Firawn stood at the center of a kingdom that moved at the sound of his command. Palaces rose because he desired them. Armies marched because he gestured. Laws changed because he spoke. To his people, he was not merely a ruler, he was the atmosphere itself, unseen yet suffocating, shaping every breath they took. And somewhere within that intoxicating height of power, a thought hardened inside him like stone. Perhaps there was no authority above his own. That whisper would soon define his destiny and reshape an entire nation. He inherited wealth, infrastructure, and an obedient bureaucracy. Yet, inheritance alone does not produce delusion. Delusion grows slowly, fed by applause and protected by fear. Advisors learned quickly that survival depended on agreement. Priests adjusted their language to mirror his ambitions. Citizens lowered their eyes and disciplined their tongues. When no one challenges a ruler, he begins to mistake silence for approval and approval for truth. In that distorted mirror, Firawn saw not a servant of God, but a self-created monument. Towering, permanent, unquestionable. He forgot the clay beneath his feet and the breath within his chest that was borrowed. Arrogance rarely arrives announcing itself as rebellion. It dresses first as confidence. Firawn's projects multiplied, his monument stretched toward the sky, and his name was carved into stone as though permanence could be engineered. Each success insulated him further from vulnerability. Each triumph erased another reminder of his mortality. Surrounded by luxury, he grew allergic to contradiction. Surrounded by praise, he lost the ability to question himself. The more he conquered externally, the more fragile he became internally, because any threat to his narrative now felt like an attack on his very existence. Pride demands constant reinforcement and constant submission. And so the language of governance shifted subtly. It was no longer about stewardship but supremacy, no longer about responsibility but reverence. When he finally declared, "I am your highest lord," it was not a spontaneous eruption. It was the logical conclusion of years spent erasing the divine from public consciousness. A society conditioned to fear cannot easily distinguish between authority and divinity. A person trained to obey without reflection may begin to worship without realizing it. Fir awn did not simply demand taxes and labor, he demanded psychological surrender. He required hearts to bow before his throne, unquestioningly and absolutely. But no human being is born believing he is divine. Such a claim requires reinforcement, repetition, and insulation from doubt. It requires a narrative that drowns conscience before conscience can protest. Firawn's court became an echo chamber where ambition was celebrated and restraint was mocked. Those who hesitated were silenced. Those who resisted disappeared. Over time, the abnormal became normal. The outrageous became policy. The unimaginable became routine. And in that steady moral erosion, a space opened within his heart where accountability once lived. A vacuum that welcomed whispers subtle for others to detect and dangerous enough to reshape destiny. It is in such vacuums that tyranny matures, not overnight, but through 1,000 small permissions granted to the ego. Every unchecked decision convinces the soul that it is self-sufficient. Every successful oppression convinces the mind that consequences are myths. Feron began to see himself not as a man sustained by divine mercy, but as a source of provision for others. If the Nile flowed, it was because of him. If crops grew, it was under his blessing. Gratitude shifted from heaven to palace. And with each shift, humility retreated further into the shadows until pride stood alone and unchallenged. Yet beneath the golden ceremony, beneath the banners and proclamations, a mortal heart continued beating, a heart that would one day stutter in terror as water closed around it. For now, however, that future felt impossible. When a ruler controls narrative, environment, and fear itself, he begins to imagine he controls destiny. This is the final stage of delusion. not merely denying God, but believing oneself immune to consequence. And once a man believes he cannot fall, he becomes the perfect target for a whisper that promises permanence. And that whisper would soon find him in corridors of power. Long before Firawn ever placed a crown upon his head, another being had already declared war against humility. Iblis was not a myth whispered to frighten children. He was a reality defined by rebellion. When he refused to bow to Adam, it was not ignorance that drove him, but pride. He saw clay and compared it to fire, elevating his origin above obedience. In that single moment, arrogance eclipsed worship. His fall was not caused by weakness, but by self-importance. And when he was cast out, he did not ask for forgiveness, he asked for time. Time to mislead, time to whisper, time to prove that human beings too could be persuaded to choose pride over submission. Iblis understood something essential about corruption. It rarely begins with obvious evil. It begins with a suggestion, with doubt, with the subtle inflation of the self. He vowed to approach humanity from every direction, to beautify falsehood and distort truth. But he does not treat every soul the same. The weak are tempted with desire, the fearful are tempted with security, and the powerful are tempted with immortality. Leaders especially are offered a more refined deception, the illusion that they are indispensable. Unlike ordinary sins, arrogance is self-sustaining. Once a person believes he is superior, he begins to reinterpret reality to protect that belief. Iblis does not need to force such a person toward evil. He only needs to reinforce what is already forming inside. A whisper here, a justification there, a reminder of status, a warning against appearing weak. Slowly, the heart becomes insulated from correction. Conscience grows faint. Accountability feels like an insult. And the soul drifts further from its creator while convincing itself it is rising. Iblis's own story is proof of this method. Even after witnessing divine command directly, he rationalized his defiance. He framed his refusal as logical, even principled. "I am better than him," he argued. That argument did not disappear after his expulsion. It became his blueprint. Make humans compare. Make them compete for superiority. Make them resent being told they are servants. Once a person begins to resent servitude to God, he becomes vulnerable to claiming mastery over others. Pride, once seeded, does the rest. History shows that tyrants rarely start as monsters. They begin as men surrounded by praise. Gradually, they accept the praise. Eventually, they depend on it. Iblis exploits this progression. He understands that a ruler who fears losing power will justify cruelty. A ruler who fears humiliation will silence opposition. A ruler who cannot tolerate contradiction will mistake counsel for rebellion. And when such a ruler stands unchallenged long enough, the final temptation can be presented. Why acknowledge a higher authority at all? For ordinary believers, arrogance might manifest as private vanity. For rulers, it reshapes nations. Policies become reflections of ego. Laws become tools of self-preservation. Justice becomes selective. Iblis does not need to appear in visible form. His strategy thrives in invisibility. His success is measured not by dramatic spectacles, but by gradual moral erosion. A leader who once feared God begins to fear only losing control. A man who once sought guidance begins to seek validation. And when that shift occurs, the throne becomes more sacred to him than the heavens. It is important to understand that Iblis cannot compel belief. He can only invite. The Quran makes clear that on the day of judgment, he will admit he had no authority except to call, and people responded. That response, however, depends on vulnerability, and nothing creates vulnerability like unchecked power. When no one can challenge a ruler externally, the only barrier left is his internal humility. If that barrier collapses, influence flows freely. Firawn's Egypt was fertile ground for such influence, a civilization rich, structured, disciplined, and proud. a ruler elevated beyond criticism, a society conditioned to equate authority with divinity. These conditions do not create Iblis's presence, they amplify it. Pride, already breathing in the palace, only needs encouragement to declare itself absolute. And somewhere within those corridors, arrogance was no longer just personal, it was ideological. The stage was set for power to meet persuasion, and for a whisper to find a willing ear. By the time Firawn's authority felt untouchable, arrogance was no longer an emotion within him. It had become infrastructure. His palaces were built to reflect permanence, his armies trained to display dominance, and his court conditioned to echo approval. Yet, beneath the spectacle of control lived a quiet fear, the fear of losing what he had convinced himself he deserved. Power does not eliminate insecurity, it often magnifies it, and insecurity, when wrapped in authority, becomes dangerous. Fir awn's policies reveal more than ambition, they reveal anxiety. When news spread of a prophecy foretelling a child who would threaten his rule, he did not dismiss it with confidence. He responded with violence. The killing of infant boys was not strength, it was panic disguised as strategy. Only a ruler uncertain of his future seeks to eliminate it in cradles. Pride had convinced him he was supreme, but fear betrayed that he knew he was not eternal. That internal contradiction created the perfect tension for manipulation. Arrogance thrives where vulnerability is denied. Feron could not admit doubt, so doubt transformed into aggression. Every potential threat was magnified, every rumor became treason. The more he tightened his grip, the more he revealed his fragility. A truly secure leader does not need to silence opposition, only the insecure do. In this state, the heart becomes restless, scanning constantly for reassurance. It seeks validation in dominance and comfort in control. Such a heart is susceptible to reinforcement, a whisper that says, "You are right to defend your greatness." When power meets pride, moral boundaries blur. Policies that once felt extreme begin to feel necessary. Advisors who question become enemies. Those who flatter become indispensable. The court around Fir awn likely learned quickly that survival required affirmation. Over time, affirmation turned into worshipful language, and worshipful language reinforced delusion. If everyone treats a ruler as divine, the ruler may begin to believe it. Not because he has seen proof, but because he has eliminated contradiction. This is how ego inflates, not through sudden explosion, but gradual expansion. Fir awn's wealth shielded him from consequence. His armies shielded him from rebellion. His propaganda shielded him from the truth. Yet none of these shields could protect him from the reality of mortality. The body beneath the royal garments was still human, still dependent on breath and heartbeat, but pride dulls awareness of dependence. It convinces the soul that control over others equals control over destiny. It is within this psychological environment that destructive alignment occurs. Iblis does not need dramatic meetings or visible encounters. He needs conditions. A heart convinced of superiority, a mind allergic to accountability, a throne insulated from critique. Fir awn embodied these conditions. His identity fused with his authority so completely that surrender to God felt like humiliation rather than liberation. Submission, which is the essence of Islam, appeared to him as weakness. Contrast defines this moment in history. On one side stood a ruler surrounded by gold, convinced of permanence. On the other side existed the quiet reality of time, moving steadily toward judgment. Fir awn believed strength meant domination. He mistook fear for loyalty. He equated silence with respect. Yet every act of oppression deepened the distance between him and humility. Every decree reinforced the narrative that he alone determined fate. The tragedy is not merely that Fir awn claimed divinity, it is that he believed it protected him. Pride promised him stability, but it chained him to constant defense. The more he asserted control, the more fragile he became. And fragility in power is combustible. It waits for confrontation. It waits for a challenge. It waits for a moment when illusion meets undeniable truth. That moment was approaching. A child once targeted by his policies had grown. A voice shaped by revelation was preparing to speak. And when truth enters a palace built on pride, it does not knock quietly. It exposes foundations. It tests certainty. It forces a choice between humility and escalation. Fir awn would soon face that choice, and the decision he made would reveal whether arrogance had merely influenced him or fully possessed him. When Musa stood in the court of Firawn, the confrontation was not merely political, it was existential. A shepherd who once fled Egypt returned carrying revelation, not rebellion. He did not bring an army. He brought a message: worship Allah alone and release the oppressed. In a palace built upon fear and flattery, those words were heavier than any weapon. Truth does not need decoration. Its clarity unsettles falsehood by its very presence. Fir awn's reaction revealed more than irritation. It revealed exposure. For years, he had cultivated an image of unquestioned supremacy. Now a man raised under his own roof challenged that narrative publicly. Musa spoke calmly, grounded not in palace authority, but in divine commission. Contrast filled the room. One voice anchored in revelation, the other in reputation. One invited reflection, the other demanded submission. The clash was spiritual before it was social. When miracles unfolded, the staff transforming, the signs manifesting, the atmosphere shifted. Fir awn attempted to recast revelation as sorcery. It was a strategic move. If he could frame divine proof as trickery, he could preserve control. Yet even this strategy exposed anxiety. A confident God does not need to compete with magicians. A secure ruler does not fear demonstration. Fir awn's insistence on rivalry betrayed the cracks forming beneath his certainty. The gathering of magicians was meant to stage a spectacle of dominance. Instead, it became a moment of unraveling. When they witnessed Musa's sign and recognized the truth, they fell into prostration. Their transformation was immediate and costly. They chose faith over safety, conviction over comfort. In that instant, Fir awn faced something more threatening than political dissent, public humility before a higher authority. His rage was swift because their submission shattered his illusion of absolute control. Power that depends on intimidation cannot tolerate voluntary defiance. Fir awn threatened mutilation and crucifixion, believing fear could restore order. Yet fear no longer held the same force. The magician's calm acceptance of punishment contrasted sharply with his frantic attempts to reassert dominance. Here, pride met unyielding belief. One clung to a throne, the others clung to faith. The difference revealed which foundation was stable. Revelation has a way of narrowing choices. Fir awn could have paused. He could have reconsidered. The signs before him were not subtle, but arrogance resists retreat because retreat feels like humiliation. To admit error would dismantle years of self-deification. It would require him to redefine strength as submission rather than supremacy. That psychological cost felt greater to him than physical destruction. As Musa continued to deliver warnings and signs intensified, Fir awn doubled down. Each plague, each disruption could have softened his heart. Instead, they hardened it. Temporary relief brought temporary promises, quickly withdrawn once stability returned. This cycle revealed a deeper pattern. Repentance without humility is negotiation, not transformation. Fir awn did not seek forgiveness. He sought convenience. The confrontation between Musa and Fir awn was never equal in nature. One stood as a servant delivering truth. The other stood as a ruler defending illusion. Every exchange magnified the contrast between divine patience and human pride. Musa's message did not fluctuate with pressure. Fir awn's posture shifted with circumstance. Yet despite mounting evidence, he chose escalation over surrender. When leaders fear losing narrative control, they often intensify aggression. Fir awn's oppression increased, surveillance tightened, punishments multiplied. The more revelation exposed his vulnerability, the more violently he attempted to conceal it. But truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. It lingers. It is unsettling. It plants doubt even in fortified hearts. The palace that once echoed with unquestioned praise now echoed with tension. Advisors saw the signs, citizens whispered of miracles, the illusion of invincibility wavered. Yet Fir awn interpreted instability not as a warning, but as a challenge. And so he prepared not for reflection, but for pursuit. The final stage of pride was approaching, a decision that would carry him from throne room to shoreline, from proclamation to desperation. By the time Musa led the children of Israel toward the shore, the confrontation had moved beyond debate. It was no longer about signs within palaces or arguments before courtiers. It was about destiny, unfolding in open space. Fir awn had watched plague after plague disturb his kingdom, each one a warning wrapped in mercy. Yet mercy, when repeatedly ignored, becomes evidence against the one who rejects it. Now he faced a choice that would define his end, allow them to leave or chase them into uncertainty. Logic should have restrained him. The signs had been undeniable. The magician's transformation had been public. His own promises of release had been spoken. But arrogance does not evaluate risk rationally. It evaluates risk emotionally. To let Musa depart freely would mean admitting weakness. It would signal that his authority had limits. And for a man who had declared himself supreme, limitation felt more terrifying than danger. Reports reached him that the Israelites were escaping. In that moment, two forces likely collided within him, fear and pride. Fear whispered caution. Pride demanded pursuit. Pride won. He summoned his army, armored in confidence and mounted on strength. The decision appeared bold, even heroic to those who still believed in his supremacy. But beneath the spectacle of military movement lay a refusal to accept reality. As the army advanced, the horizon narrowed. Ahead lay a sea, behind lay soldiers. The Israelites saw entrapment. Musa saw promise. Fir awn saw an opportunity. He interpreted their apparent cornering as proof of his dominance. Here was the moment to crush rebellion publicly and permanently. Yet what he mistook for advantage was the edge of judgment. Arrogance often blinds a person to patterns. Every prior sign had disrupted his control. Every warning had exposed his vulnerability. Still, he interpreted circumstances through the lens of self-assurance. When Musa struck the sea and the waters parted, the event was not subtle. Walls of water rose, forming pathways where none had existed. This was not sorcery. It was a manifestation of divine will. At that threshold, Fir awn faced perhaps his final moment of clarity. The sea did not part at his command. The path did not open because of his power. He could have paused. He could have recognized the scale of what stood before him. Instead, pride reframed the miracle as a challenge. If the sea opens, it must be conquerable. If the Israelites pass through, he could follow. The whisper that had once inflated his identity now urged persistence. Do not retreat. Do not appear weak. And so he entered. His army followed, driven by loyalty, fear, or confusion. Surrounded by walls of water, he rode forward into a corridor that existed only by divine permission. This was the ultimate contrast, a man claiming godhood, traveling within a path he did not create, sustained by forces he could not command. Every hoofbeat echoed against liquid boundaries, held in place not by engineering, but by decree. There are moments when reality demands surrender. Pride resists even then. When the waters began to close, when the illusion of safety dissolved, Fir awn's certainty fractured. The man who once declared supremacy now confronted helplessness. The army that symbolized invincibility dissolved into chaos. Strength, numbers, armor, none negotiated with the sea. As water surrounded him, the narrative he had built over years collapsed in seconds. In desperation, he proclaimed belief. But belief born at the edge of annihilation is not the same as belief nurtured by humility. His declaration came not from submission cultivated over time, but from panic confronting consequence. The sea did not respond to his words. Judgment had already been set in motion. The waves closed. The army vanished. The throne of Egypt stood empty. Arrogance had carried him from palace to shoreline, from proclamation to drowning. The whisper that once promised elevation had guided him into descent. And as the waters settled, silence returned. Not the silence of stability, but the silence that follows irreversible consequences. Yet the story was not complete. One sign remained, preserved not for him, but for those who would come after. When the sea closed over Firawn and his army, history could have ended there, a tyrant drowned, a nation liberated. But the core and reveals something extraordinary. His body was preserved as a sign for those who would come later. Not his throne, not his empire, not his proclamations, his body. The same body that once stood adorned in silk and gold would remain exposed to time, stripped of illusion. The ruler who claimed permanence was reduced to evidence. There is profound contrast in that preservation. Feron sought immortality through monuments, yet what endured was not his architecture but his defeat. He imagined his name would echo as divine authority, yet it echoes now as warning. The body that once commanded armies lies silent, incapable of issuing a single decree. Preservation, in his case, was not honor, it was testimony. This is the final collapse of arrogance. Pride convinces a person that power shields them from consequence. But power cannot negotiate with mortality. The preserved body stands as a visible contradiction to every claim he made. It announces that human strength, no matter how vast, remains dependent. It reminds every observer that kings and servants share the same end. The Quranic narrative does not preserve his body to satisfy curiosity. It preserves it to provoke reflection. How does a man rise to such heights of self-deification? How does a heart reach a point where surrender feels worse than destruction? Fir awn's story is not only about ancient Egypt, it is about the anatomy of ego. His external tyranny began with internal inflation. Before he enslaved others, he enslaved himself to pride. Iblis's method did not change across generations. Inflate the self, minimize accountability, beautify dominance, diminish humility. Once those steps are complete, destruction becomes inevitable. Fir awn represents the extreme manifestation of a disease that can exist in smaller forms within anyone. The impulse to control, the resistance to correction, the discomfort with submission. These seeds, if nurtured, grow quietly. Modern readers may not command armies or declare divinity, but the lesson transcends scale. Pride appears in subtler forms, in refusal to admit error, in resentment toward guidance, in the desire to dominate conversations, relationships, or narratives. Fir awn's preserved body asks a haunting question: where does arrogance begin today? Not in palaces, perhaps, but in hearts. Contrast defines the closing reflection. Firawn pursued eternal recognition and achieved eternal warning. He claimed superiority and became an example. He resisted submission and met helplessness. Meanwhile, Musa, who owned no palace, left a legacy rooted in obedience. True elevation, the story teaches, does not come from proclaiming greatness, but from acknowledging dependence. The sea that drowned Fir awn became a passage of salvation for others. The same event that marked his destruction marked liberation for the oppressed. This dual outcome reveals a deeper truth. Divine justice operates beyond human calculation. What appears like a delay is preparation. What appears like dominance may conceal downfall. Firawn's preserved body remains a silent sermon. It does not speak, yet it testifies. It testifies that arrogance cannot sustain itself indefinitely. It testifies that whispers promising immortality are lies. It testifies that power without humility corrodes from within. And it testifies that history does not bury lessons. It uncovers them for those willing to reflect. The secret meeting between arrogance and authority did not require recorded conversation. Its evidence is written in consequence. Fir awn listened to pride and drowned in it. His story endures so that others may recognize the whisper before it becomes declaration, the declaration before it becomes oppression, and the oppression before it becomes ruin.